Welcome to another episode of Ally Insights. I'm Eugene and I'm the CEO of Engage. So today we have a great and interesting guest. His name is Denis Boudreau. He's a consultant, trainer, and coach and speaker. He's also an author of a book called Inclusive Speaker and the founder of an organization called Inclusive Communications. Welcome to the podcast, Denis.
Thank you, Eugene. Happy to be here.
Let's just get started by telling us your story. How did you get involved in the accessibility field?
Well, I've been in this field for about 25 years now. It goes all the way back to the summer of 2000, August. So it's going to be 24 years this year. And it all began for me as with a project manager coming to me and asking me to create a website that blind people could use. We had no idea what that meant. We had just won this project to redo the website of an hospital here in Montreal. And they had a wing of the hospital dedicated to eye trauma. And the people that were running the project said, we have a lot of people who have visual challenges and we want them to be able to use the website. So the website you'll have to build will need to be accessible to people who are blind. And none of us knew anything about accessibility. And because my role typically was to figure out things that weren't working, they said, hey, figure this one out. And so I did. So I went online and then back then I was using Northern Lights and Alta Vista as search engines. And Google was not really all that popular for me still back then. And the quick search helped me find the web content accessibility guidelines that had been adopted a year before by the W3C, and it blew my mind that there were rules out there to create content that would actually be usable by people with different types of disabilities. And so that's how it began. For a lot of people, it begins with, a personal challenge because of a disability or knowing someone who struggles with digital content and they become invested in wanting to do that. For me, it was just, oh, we have to do this and we don't know how to do it. And then, of course, after that, meeting a bunch of people with disabilities over the years, discovering more about my own disabilities that I knew nothing about back then or very little about, all that made it gave it a lot more purpose and meaning, and I've been doing that ever since. So that's the story in a nutshell.
That's a great story. Yeah, it's always, there are many people, like you said, come into the field either because they are personally involved in it, they're personally impacted by it, or because in your case, like you had a problem you had to solve, which is very similar to our case as well. So tell us about what you do now. Tell us about inclusive communications. I know you speak, you also write books. Tell us a little bit about what you do right now.
The focus of inclusive communication is really helping leaders and organizations, discover the gaps in their DEI initiatives. So in a nutshell, what I bring is a realization that people, when they embrace some kind of a DEI initiative, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative, project, framework, or whatnot, they're all over the popular ones, if you will, the popular, characteristics that we protect, right? Gender, sexuality, gender expression, or anything about representation for gender, any of those things. But very few people actually consider disability to be something that needs to be part of DEI initiatives, which is in part why a lot of people feel the need to add a B to that DEI to bring the belong part into it as well, for people with disabilities. So that's what I do. I help these organizations better understand how disability inclusion plays a huge part in or should play a huge part in DEI initiatives, so that their workplaces become more inclusive of people with employees with disabilities, so that those employees can thrive and be successful and contribute to the full extent of their potential. So that's the biggest part of my business today. And because of the 24 years of accessibility, digital accessibility consultancy, training and all that. Then another part of my business, of course, relates to helping organizations make their websites, their communications, their documents more accessible to meet those guidelines, or just to be more accessible to people with different types of disabilities. In a nutshell, that's what I do.
Okay, great. Very, very broad. But I really like your focus with leaders or business leaders. I think it's a big challenge. I don't want, I hate using the word convincing them about the importance of accessibility. But tell us a little bit about, you've worked with a lot of leaders in these big organizations. What would you say to a business leader who doesn't think that either disability or accessibility is a priority? Because like you said, it's not very trendy, it's not very popular. I mean, unfortunately, how do what do you say to business leaders like that?
Well, it oftentimes begins with some kind of a business case, right? So building that business case for them, making them understand what that's about. So a significant piece of this is just talking about neurodiversity as an example, and how, statistically speaking, it's roughly 20% of the population that
Yep.
self-identifies as being neurodivergent with, one condition or situation or another, or multiple ones. And then also 27% of the population self-identifies as having a disability. So from the perspective of a leader in an organization, a people manager, someone leading a business, for instance,
Right.
with employees, as soon as that particular leader recognizes that they have, you know, hiring policies or practices that are meant to be
Right.
equal, and welcoming of everyone, then they should have a certain number of their employee or workforce that has disabilities as well. It may not be 20% or 27%, but even if it was 10% of their workforce, knowing that that 10% can't potentially, perform to the full extent of their potential because of barriers that are, unknowingly created within the business. Most leaders would want to address that and create an environment that is more conducive to people being successful and contributing to the full extent of their potential. So that's how the conversations start most of the time. To me, the way that I approach this, um, is from the standpoint of, it really does begin with the leaders. So they
Right.
have to understand what we're talking about, which means discovering different aspects of, like, I've put together this framework, if you will, this model that helps leaders walk through the different steps, if you will, of really building this understanding, which, like, I work with, like, I call them the 15 keys of inclusive speaking. And the very first one is just understanding disability. Like, what are we talking about? And what does that mean? What does that represent? And then we go through different aspects, such as, disability etiquette. Like, how do you discuss, how do you address the question of disability? What words can you use? What words can't you
Right.
use? How do you behave with someone with disability? What's different? What shouldn't be different? Things like stigma, things like prejudice, things like, emergency preparedness in the business. If you are, say, on the 10th floor of a building, and you have different emergency, procedures that are in place, in case there's a fire, for instance, what are you going to be doing about your employee, say Steve, who's in a wheelchair, if you can't use the elevators when
Right.
there's a fire? Like, what is the plan to help Steve evacuate the building when there are 10 flights of stairs to go down? Like, things like that. We talk about inclusive communication, which is a huge piece. So you mentioned my book earlier, The Inclusive Speaker. That entire book is dedicated to this idea of inclusive communication. So how do we communicate with our workforce, with our target audience or market out there, so that they feel included, don't feel excluded from their conversations because of the words that we use or the way that we present the material that we leverage. Different things like that, representation, or allyship, even like being an ally for people with disabilities within the organization, leveraging your privileges to be able to help them, like, create a space where people can feel more confident and build the trust, so that people actually want to come forward and disclose what their needs are, so that we can provide the right accommodations. Like that's the kind of thing that we work
Okay.
with.
Could you share a little bit of, I know you mentioned your framework. I think you have a framework called Jedi, or something like that. Could you share a little bit about, whether it's a framework for assessing, for leaders to use, or a communication framework, something practical, that to share it to our audience? Like, how do you, yeah, what?
So,
Yeah,
so right. So the way that this framework is organized, for the time being, I call it LEADS,
yeah,
LEADS.
okay,
And every letter basically covers three of those 15 different aspects that I mentioned before, these keys, if you will. So the framework, basically the framework is, we start with launch, elevate, advocate, drive, and sustain. And basically the idea is that as we learn these different components, these different aspects, we become more aware of how we can approach disability to bring it into the business. And by doing this and getting maturity as in all these different aspects, we foster a more inclusive environment. And
got it.
so I use that logic with a typical maturity model, typical maturity model, like 5 steps models, where
Right.
you begin as like a completely like a new, like a like a newbie, basically. 5 being like very well established with that particular thing. So for every step of that model, or that ladder, if you will, there are different aspects that I help my clients integrate into their practice, so that they progressively grow this understanding and
Okay.
create this environment that becomes more conducive for inclusion.
Okay. All right. I want to switch over to the business case, because when you mentioned business case, that was, as a business owner, and as someone who knows a lot of businesses, a lot of business owners, and I do try and convince them and try and give them a business case for accessibility. And I'll be honest, it's very challenging. It's, I get a lot of pushbacks. So
I'm sure you do.
in
Yeah.
your in your opinion, in your experience, what's the best way to go out to build a compelling business case, either for someone like me who's trying to sell a product into the accessibility space, or for someone within the organization who's trying to get buy-in from their leaders?
Hmm. It really depends on who you're talking to. If we're talking to leaders, the conversation is different than if we're talking to, say, frontline workers, developers, designers, or whatnot.
Right.
So if we focus on the leaders and how the conversation is framed around those folks, I would say that one of the main areas to discuss are probably related to the legal landscape, what it is that they have in terms of legal obligations, for instance. So you're
Okay.
based in Toronto, so you're on Ontario. Ontario has the
Yep.
AODA,
Oh
the
yeah.
Only
Yep.
for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. So there's an actual law in Ontario that forces businesses, that makes sure that businesses are accessible. It's not just the government or the public sector, it's also the private sector in this case. So if a business, if an organization does business in Ontario, for instance, if they're Canadian, that becomes a very significant part of our conversation. Did you know that, there are laws that actually mandate you to do this? So this, regardless of the fact that you think it's relevant or not, there's a law for
Right.
this. It's been around for, almost 20 years now. It came
Yep.
in 2005. So, that's one aspect of it. If my clients are American, which a lot of them are, then we're talking about the accessible, the
ADA.
ADA, the
Yeah.
Americans with Disabilities Act, and how that is being leveraged for, over 4,500 lawsuits every year, based on research that is done by Usable Net every year. So again, there's this legal landscape that you want to like paint a portrait of,
Okay.
so that people understand that. So that's one piece of it. And that would be the stick, right? The carrot
Yeah.
on the other end, which the much more interesting conversation for business owners, is to say, hey, do you realize what market we're talking about here? So I mentioned earlier in our conversation that 27% of the population has a disability or self-identifies as such. That's true both in Canada and the US, based on the data from Statistics Canada and also from the CDC in the United States. So we happen to be at the very same level in terms of that prevalence. And when you look at the after-tax disposable income of people with disabilities in Canada, according to the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, that's $55 billion a year. If you look at the United States, where they have roughly 9 times more people than we do, according to the American Institutes of Research, their after-tax disposable income for people with disabilities is $504 billion a year. So it's a huge, untapped, underserved market to begin with. So if you build products, if you have services that are accessible to those folks, you have a potential of clients that you can work with that are usually not serviced really well, or that struggle with using products. So you can differentiate yourself that way. But it's not just about, the potential of the potential of that market per se. It's also people who gravitate around those folks. Like there's a book actually written by Rich Donovan, also from Toronto, called Unleash Different. And in that book, he makes the case for what he calls the disability market. And the disability market being people with disabilities, but also their loved ones, people
Right.
that care about them, their colleagues, their families, like people that are like revolving around those folks. And that comes up to 53% of the global market. So more than half of the global market can be swayed one way or another based on whether you are inclusive or not, or whether you are leaving people behind or not. So from the perspective of, and that brings us into a different aspect of that conversation, which is, or that business case, which is really to talk about the perception of the public with regards to your business or your organization. There are dozens of examples out there on Google. It's very easy to find. I'm not going to name names, but it's very easy to find organizations whose names have been seriously, or reputation has been seriously damaged because they pushed back on accessibility
Right.
claims that were made for them. Some of them going as far as 20 years ago, and that we still name today as examples of what not to do when someone asks about accommodations on
Right.
websites or whatnot. um, so the reputational risks are also a huge part of that business, building that business case. If we go back to money, the other thing also that's interesting is that we keep thinking about disability or accessibility as being for people with disabilities. But once you start broadening that up, you realize very quickly that our aging population, and by that I don't just mean the seniors, but I mean anyone who's in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and eventually considered more of a senior, our senses do deteriorate with time. And anyone who's old enough listening to this will realize or already knows that, your vision, your hearing, your ability to sustain a cognitive effort over time, your dexterity, all these things start, going down with time. So when you create accessible products, accessible websites, those websites are also easier to use for you as someone who does not identify with a disability, but still has issues compared to how they would have behaved 20 years before. So in that group, when you just look at the again, I don't have the details for the US, but I remember Canada here. When you look at the after-tax disposable income of folks over the age of 65 in Canada, it's over $218 billion a year. So again, we're going back to this market, this really big potential
Right.
market that you can leverage or tap into more when you pay attention to accessibility. So, and then on top of that, of course, there are things like, making the case around, an improved user experience that you would have. If it's more accessible, it's easier to use for everyone. So, I mean, like, there's not a day that goes by where I don't hear about someone, complaining about how difficult a website is to use because of
Yep.
accessibility barriers. But I've yet to hear about anyone complaining that a website was too easy to use, that they wish it had been more complicated. That doesn't happen. And
No, it
when you
doesn't. Yeah.
create a website that is accessible, or like an application or a document or whatnot, and it works really well and smoothly, a lot of it has to do with accessibility. Like if you create these accessibility features or add them to your products, it's going to make a better experience as a result of that, therefore helping everyone in the process. And I mean, there's a lot of other things we can talk about. I mean, innovation is an example of that. When we look into if we bring it back to the workplace, for instance, um if you have a bunch of people in your workforce that are all basically the same, let's say they were all you know white males, for instance, they may be really good at what they do, but their perspective is limited by their own understanding and their own reality, their own culture. So when you start diversifying your team and you bring more people to it, you have different perspectives that can come together, and then that brings more creativity, more innovation, more ideas to solve problems. So all those things are examples of what we can talk about in terms of creating building a business case around inclusion.
Okay. I'm glad you brought up the market example on how big or how large the market size is. I mean, if because you're right, it's not just people with disabilities. If you look at the extension of family members, friends, supporters, it's a really big market, and that's one of the, I would say, one of the myths or things that a lot of misunderstanding around accessibility is that, hey, it's a small niche market, and it's not worth your time. And yes, if it weren't for the compliance, like people wouldn't do it. What are some other myths you've heard from business leaders around accessibility?
Well, the fact that accessibility is a small or insignificant market is certainly a big one that we hear about all the time. I mean,
Mm.
I've spoken to that already, so I'm not going to go back to these things, but it is clearly something that we sort of run against all the time. Another significant one would be that accessible websites are boring. As an example, that's like one we
Yeah,
hear about quite a bit
yeah,
too, which is founded in some truth. If you go back 20 years ago,
yeah,
an accessible website was a website without any pictures. It was just
yeah,
text, black text on a white background, so it was
yeah.
like text based, not very interesting.
Hmm.
But I mean, it's been years since you can create a very like immersive, interesting, visually exciting, appealing interface and different services within or features within that interface that can still be made to be accessible from the very beginning. So and we have great examples out there with Microsoft and Apple and other big companies like that who've invested in creating more accessible products. Salesforce is another example. I mean, none of them are perfect, but a
Right,
lot of them are leading the way in a lot of ways in terms of showing that these things are possible. So you know that myth is one that we see quite a bit as well. Um, Another one might be related to the fact that a surprisingly high number of business owners will say, yeah, but blind people don't come to our website, so people with disabilities don't come to our
right.
website. And my first thought is always, how do you know? I mean, did you ask
I know.
anyone? Like, what's your
Yeah.
like? Is it a gut feeling? Because
Hmm.
and even if that was true, why aren't they coming? Is it because what you provide is not interesting to them, or is it because that there are so many barriers that they can't even do it? Should they want to? And when you think about it, you know, whether you sell a product or a service, and a lot of people will say that, like, let's say for instance, you could have a shoe company, um pick any brand that you like running shoes for instance, and you could say, well, blind people don't run, why would I
Right,
ever want to
right,
bother with that? But blind people can buy shoes for their nephews, or for their spouse, or so all these things are possible as well. So the idea that people don't use blind that people with disabilities don't use technology could not be further from the truth today, especially considering the fact that with every passing year there's less and less possibilities of actually being serviced in person. Like, you have to use the web for those
yep,
things.
yep,
And everyone has to pay their taxes. Everyone has to do some banking. Everyone has to order something on Amazon. Everyone needs to do all these different things. So every time that someone runs into an issue where they can't actually do what they're trying to do, and they need to ask somebody else for help, it's a reminder to them that they don't really matter. So again, we're going back to the reputation. If I have a really hard time on your website trying to buy something, I'm going to tell people that I know how bad of an experience that was, and that can lead them to also decide, well, if that's the case, I'm also going to move to a different, a
right,
competitor that actually cares about this and doesn't make you feel so excluded from society. So all these things really are part of it. And maybe another one that comes to mind that I hear all the time is how accessibility, won't really have to think about it right now. We can just think about that later on in the project. I mean, once
yep,
we get
yep,
to our QA
yep,
phase, like, we'll check
yep,
for accessibility, we'll run like a grid or a
right,
checklist, and then fix things there. But again, years and years and years of data shows that the more time it takes before you actually pay attention to accessibility, the harder it's going to be, the more expensive it's going to be, because it's
right,
so much easier. As an example, it's so much easier to, come up with an accessible color palette when you're thinking about, your website at the very beginning, than it is to try and change a color that is not contrasted enough when the whole website exists and you've printed so many documents about the website and all the colors are there. Fixing that at that point, as opposed to at the very beginning, is a lot more costly and a lot more complicated. So the earlier on you think about accessibility in your process, the easier it's going to be and the less it's going to cost you also. So it makes sense to really start
right.
as early as possible in your process.
I agree 100%. I think my personal opinion is a lot of leaders, business leaders, and even leaders in organizations are very reactive when it comes to accessibility. It's always, oh, they have to comply. There's a deadline. They have to comply with ADA or something like that. Or they get sued, and then that's when they look at. Then they get and it's really difficult. They now have to remediate their entire website or like thousands and thousands of documents that are all over their site. Right?
And then
It's a
it's
very difficult process.
a lot more complex, a lot more costly than it would have been otherwise if only they had been able to think about that in the first place earlier on in that process. So yeah, I mean, we see that all the time. And unfortunately, for better or for worse, most people who come to accessibility come through the lens of having received a complaint about
Yeah.
their inaccessibility or out
Hmm.
of fear of being sued one day. And it's I mean, don't get me wrong, it's a great driver for business. That's where a lot of people like businesses come from with accessibility. And what that means is that for every person that comes to someone like me, for instance, because they want to do the right thing and they want to be proactive about inclusion, there's probably 10 other clients who discover it, out of the blue one day because they get a letter
Yeah.
complaining about their websites, or because someone threatens to sue them, and all of a sudden they freak out because they know nothing about this. And I was talking about AODA earlier, having been adopted in 2005. To this day, there's still a lot of organizations who hear about it for the first time, and it's been 20 years almost. And
Hmm.
yet the communication around that does not flow all that well, and people are not aware that these things are mandatory.
Yeah. I think one of the problems with these regulations is that there's no enforcement, and it's similar with ADA, right?
Yeah.
It's been, I mean, and a lot of times they rely on lawsuits. That's the driver. And like you said, lawsuits or complaints that drives businesses and organizations to act, and not really because they want their sites to be accessible or because they want to be compliant. It's usually something reactive. Someone complains, they get a lawsuit or something like that. I think that's
Yeah.
the unfortunate truth. Like you said, it's still
And
the majority of people, reacting as opposed to being proactive.
yeah, it absolutely is. It really is. And again, when you're working with Americans, for instance, the idea of a lawsuit is a very common reaction. This is what you do. I mean, it's part of the culture. This is not something we have in Canada. So it's harder for accessibility to really, find its roots here
Mhm.
because people don't sue all that much. Like they'll
Yep.
complain,
Yep.
but if there's no follow up or if there's no way to enforce it, as you were saying, then there's only so much that gets done. Every now and then you're lucky, and then the people on the receiving end of that complaint will say, "Hey, good point. I never thought about that. Let's do something about it." And they genuinely want to do better, and that's awesome. But for a lot of them, they're going to be looking at it from the perspective of, okay, so what do we really need to do, and how can we make it this
Yep.
go away? And that brings them into trying to find solutions that oftentimes seem really great on paper, but actually cause more issues than solve problems for them. And that's not a positive approach to it for sure.
Yeah. Are you talking about things like overlays and
I might be. I might be. So for those of
I
you, for
yeah.
those for your listeners who are not aware what overlays are, think of it as a single line of code that you put on your website that brings a little widget that fixes accessibility problems or supposedly fixes accessibility problems. Because again, research finds that most people with disabilities who are in contact with those widgets actually find that it creates more barriers for them than actually
Right.
fixing it.
Right.
And these vendors are usually really good at saying that it makes the websites compliant with these guidelines, while in reality it doesn't. And what we see again, usable, I mentioned usable net earlier, they have
Hmm.
this report every year that they publish about lawsuits. And we've seen a very steady increase year after year of lawsuits against organizations who have or use those widgets and yet still have like very difficult barriers on their websites that are not addressed by these tools. So it's a yeah, it's a false sense of security that they sell, which actually ends up being quite costly and problematic for those who use those services. So yeah.
Yeah, I think the right way to do it is certainly, as you mentioned, being proactive, adopting a more inclusive design or accessible design philosophy, and it has to kind of come from the leadership. So there's a lot of change that has to happen. And then obviously a lot of people just look at, oh no, this is much easier. We'll just buy this solution.
Well,
And then it turns out it doesn't
their
work,
marketing is great. I mean, you
Yeah,
have to give it to them. Their marketing is great. It's very promising. If you don't know anything about accessibility, of course you'd buy into that, and people do. Clearly, they're very successful in with their
right.
these business models, which is why it's so frustrating for those of us who actually understand what needs to be done, because we realize that, yeah, they're investing into these solutions, but the reality is they're not fixing anything, and they're even more exposed to risk than they were before, because now they actually believe that they're okay when in reality they're not.
Yep.
So at some point that reality catches up to them, and sometimes that's a pretty brutal awakening.
Yeah, I think I read recently one of the big overlay vendors is actually got sued by one of their clients, saying that
Yes,
actually,
yes,
yeah.
yeah,
Anyways, well, I don't want to go into that rabbit hole. So
yeah.
you mentioned you had let's switch gears a little bit. You mentioned you had clients in the U.S. So I'm going to ask you this kind of sensitive question. There's been a big backlash against DEI, and that's something I'm not sure if it affects your clients or not. But in the U.S., especially in the traditionally what we call red states, there's a big backlash against DEI, and some states like Florida, I think Oklahoma, a lot of states, not just some, like a decent amount of
Florida
states.
for is one for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah,
Yes.
they have actually banned funding of DEI departments or any type of initiative. So, like if you're in a University of Florida or just Oklahoma, like they basically have to like close essentially closed if they have funding for that department and that department depends on the DEI funding, like it's gone, right?
Yeah.
So has that impacted your work? What is your thoughts and comments on like the backlash of DEI in the US?
It's hard to talk about this without getting political, so I'm going to do my best not to go there too much. I don't think it's impacted my work all that much, because most clients that I work with tend to not be from that line of thought where DEI is a bad thing. I mean, very naturally, the clients that I work with tend to be more of the idea of, oh, DEI is actually a great thing. Of course, we welcome diversity, we welcome more inclusion, we welcome equity as much as we can, belonging, and all these good things. So it didn't really have that much of an impact. Um, you mentioned the red states. We all are aware of the current political climate in the United States, how the conversation is going, and the polarization around topics such as DEI. So, I mean, ultimately, I'd say that, to me, I'll put it this way: to me, any organization who would no longer promote a DEI initiative that they had before is a clear indication that that's a client I don't want to work with.
Okay.
That's where I'm at in my business. Like I have enough work coming my way that I can choose not to work with an organization who will just make it difficult to work with them because they don't get what we're trying to achieve. It's not the case for everybody, of course, and you don't always have that luxury. But it is a determining factor in whether or not I want to work with that client, because it's not just
Right.
the client who decides they want to work with you. It's a two-way
Right.
conversation. So that's what I would say. I mean, it hasn't really impacted anything. I tend to work with organizations who have a very clear, very visible commitment to inclusion to begin with,
Right.
and so I can't say that it's affected my work all that
Okay.
much.
That's good. That's good to know. Yeah. I think good to hear.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So I'm gonna, I have a few more questions. But I think I want to and I've been asking a lot of questions. So maybe this is, maybe, I want to ask you what is one question I should have asked you that I didn't ask?
Wow. Let's see. I'm not sure. I mean, we covered a lot of different
Yeah.
elements that are foundational in the work that I do. I mean, I hope that through the conversation, people are like, oh, maybe we should pay attention to this more if we haven't. Um, I mean, I, one question that you could have asked relates to the importance of training your team, for
Okay.
instance. mean, I was talking about how like these 15 keys, for instance, for to create or build this more inclusive workplace. Um, Training is a foundational aspect of opening your mind to things you don't understand. And I think that one of the biggest barriers for DEI in organizations is ignorance. And I don't mean ignorance in the sense that people are not intelligent. I mean ignorance in the sense that you don't know what you don't know, right? So
Right.
if you hear about these DEI policies, again, we see that in the States, right? I mean, all of a sudden, Kamala Harris is a DEI hire. That's what she is. She's not a prosecutor. She's not
Right.
all the wonderful things that she's accomplished. She's a DEI token because that serves a particular narrative that the other side has at the moment. So a lot of that comes from ignorance. A lot of that comes from not understanding the others and what they are, who they are, what they need, what they mean, all that stuff. And that creates these barriers again. So training and aware, like raising awareness is so important to get people to buy into this. If you come from if you've been raised in a very again, I'm going to pick on white guys because I'm one of them. So if you were raised in an environment where it's mostly white folks and everybody thinks the same way, and all of a sudden someone different comes in, of course it's a little threatening because you don't really know what they mean, what they want,
Mhm.
you don't really get them. And how could you possibly adopt a more inclusive perspective if you've never been challenged with that? Training does a lot of that. So on top of training people to learn how to build accessible websites, training people on seeing the world a little differently, a little more openly, does wonderful things in terms of creating these spaces that are going to be more welcoming afterwards. So training is a
Training. Okay.
significant aspect, I think, like foundational aspect of all this work.
Great. Thank you for asking that question and answering that question. So we're gonna wrap up real quick. It's a pleasure talking to you. I learned a
Yeah,
lot.
likewise.
If someone wanted to contact you or wanted to like read your book, just kind of tell them what's an easy way to get in touch with you.
So my website is inclusive.ca. That's inklusiv.ca. The book is The Inclusive Speaker. So that's the book, basically. It's on Amazon. Um, People tell me it's great. I think it's great. It basically speaks to, it's intended for people who communicate in front of an audience, right? So whether you're a speaker, whether you're in a meeting room with your clients or your peers, how can you communicate your ideas in a way that will be as inclusive as possible, taking into account the different expectations and or challenges that some people might have based on disabilities or conditions that are different than yours, and helping them see a path through becoming more inclusive as communicators. That's what the book is about. It's got over 200 different tips and tricks to achieve that. And yeah, I mean, pretty good read, apparently. That's what people say. I'm happy to say that. I think it is also. But yeah.
All
So
right.
yeah, so inclusive.ca, and then that's the book.
Cool. And we'll add the links in the podcast. And yeah, go check out the book in Amazon. So thank you very much again, Denny. Thank you very
You're
much.
very welcome. Thank you for having me. Yeah.